So, welcome to the Pulsus Research Seminar for this week. Those of you who come to these seminars regularly will know that this is a place in which we showcase the best research, both done within the department by our colleagues, but also by visitors and people who come to spend time in the department. It's a great opportunity to welcome Al Stark today, who of course is another one of our own. Al is one of our the kind of key people in our very dynamic group of governance and public policy staff. Al's special focus in his research is on governance and crisis management, and it's a great opportunity to have him here to talk to us about this. I did try and convince him not to use a PowerPoint, but he's of a particular generation where he's unable to speak without his PowerPoint. So it will be Al and the slides.
Okay. Thanks very much, Chris. Compliments and slight insults. Thanks very much. Okay, this is a book project. It's a book project that's 2/3 of the way complete, and that has implications for the presentation in the sense that I'm probably going to go out with a whimper rather than a bang. I have lots of findings, but if you like, not a great deal of conclusions. It's a conventional book, so it's a conventional paper. I'm going to go through problem, literature's response to the problem, my dissatisfaction with that, my response, which is obviously awesome, both conceptual and methodological, and then a series of findings. And I think there is an opportunity for a process of puzzling through some of the findings together, because I don't have the conclusions at the moment. So I have 3 out of 4 case studies complete, 1 final case study to go, and then, as I say, some conclusions to think about. I would just say before I begin properly that this is very much a book made in the School of Political Science, so some people deserve giving thanks. That the ideas were trialled in the Giving Form colloquium. Numerous people have helped me with discussions and advice, and at least all, well, probably more than the school, but I think all members of the school have at least heard me moan about this book for about 18 months now. So you've all got a little bit of a part to play, and you've played it very well. Well, that's only 1/3 of the morning teaching, and that's to factor in. Okay, so I'll begin. A few pictures. In 1988, or between 1988 and the mid-90s in the UK, bovine spongiform encephalopathy emerged in the food chain in the UK, translated into Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, and killed 177 British citizens. The Phillips inquiry into BSE made one significant claim, which was that governments had to become more effective at making sense of crises as they emerged and as they incubated. A couple of years later, after the destruction and culling and burning of around 10 million livestock and a cost of £8 million to the UK economy, after the foot and mouth epidemic of 2001, the Anderson inquiry made exactly the same claim. In 1986, I don't know if everyone can see this, in 1986 the Challenger space shuttle exploded seconds after takeoff, obviously killing everyone on board. The accident inquiry panel into that disaster cited a reckless safety culture as the primary cause. 2003, Columbia space shuttle disintegrates on its return to Earth. The accident inquiry panel into that disaster cited exactly the same reason. The final one is a picture of Hurricane Rita, which was the first significant weather event to hit the Gulf of Mexico after Katrina. You can see the same motorway in the same picture. Congestion, delay in the evacuation process. Despite an attempt to learn the lessons of Katrina, 3 people died on congested motorways after or during the evacuation of Rita. Incidents and examples such as these are commonplace within crisis management literature, and they are used to reinforce a conventional supposition that governments struggle to learn from crises and disasters. Okay. Underneath that conventional supposition, there is a specific series of claims made about the dominant institution used to understand crises and disasters, the post-crisis inquiry. These are often cited as problematic for a number of different reasons. Okay? So the big claim, the first claim, in terms of government struggling to learn lessons, that claim tends to be reinforced through reference to patterns of causality across time. So the argument is that we see patterns of causality in the causes of crises and a degree of generic causes. We also see patterns of mismanagement, so pathologies in the government responses to crises across time. You see this in disaster management literature. You see it in organisational theory, which discusses crises. You see it in governance and public policy theory. So these patterns suggest that we have a propensity to repeat the mistakes of the past. And then when you drop a gear and look at crises, inquiries rather specifically, you see claims of this nature. That inquiries are ineffective because they are ceremonial, they are ritualistic, they're about politics, that information becomes ammunition, they're about blame avoidance or agenda management, or they pay homage to forms of foundational knowledge which are problematic and actually recreate structures of power and so forth which are the causes of these crises in the first instance. So this is a very pessimistic view, obviously, of the post-crisis period. It suggests that after crises, these mechanisms are engaged, and all they really do is hit the reset button and take us back to a past, and for history to then repeat itself in a way which is familiar. Okay? Everyone who knows me knows that I am not pessimistic. I can't even say that with a straight face. I am I wrote down here, I am an optimistic, cheery, non-whinging Scotsman. I'll just scrub that out. I'll never say that again. So I want to, in this book, push back against these conventional suppositions. Right? And there's enough a priori to do that. If one looks at political science literatures and some crisis governance literatures, you can find reasons to push back against these conventional suppositions. So if you look at parliamentary studies, for example, in parliamentary scholarship they often look at parliamentary inquiries, and there's emerging arguments that if you elongate the analysis historically and look at the impact of an inquiry across a longer time frame, they become more important and outcomes start to emerge. If you look at crisis management literature, there's an emerging agenda around intra-crisis learning, the ability of governments to learn during moments of uncertainty and complexity, and to change and adapt. And there are crisis management successes, frameworks and systems that have worked well, and one could presuppose that underneath them some form of learning has taken place. So there's reasons to push back if one looks across a kind of disparate range of literatures, but there's also conceptual and methodological weaknesses in inquiry literature itself. Okay? So what I'm doing in this book is kind of testing this conventional supposition that we struggle to learn, that we repeat the mistakes of the past, and that inquiry should be indicted in that problem. So the central question of the book is, do inquiries lead to forms of policy learning that reduce vulnerability to future crises? And obviously there's going to be a degree of context in that. So the secondary question is, well, how and in what circumstances do inquiries succeed or fail in terms of policy learning? And frankly, the fact that this, we all know that political science doesn't provide definitive answers to any question, right? So the question will remain unanswered. That's a given. But frankly, the fact that we haven't even come close to properly answering or addressing or even setting down some proper markers in this area, to me is an indictment of the academy and its ability to learn rather than the institution. UNISDR tells us that in 2015, 98.6 million people were affected by a natural disaster in 2015. The average cost of an inquiry is anywhere between $20 and $40 million. Okay, these are significant institutions. They come and go. One recommendation from the Victorian Bushfire Royal Commission was costed at $1.2 billion. Okay, one of the 67 recommendations. These are significant institutions playing an important role in our policies, and yet we're still talking in terms of suppositions. So that takes me to the next step, which is my displeasure with the Academy, which is familiar territory. And I guess for me, it's displeasure with the inquiry literature, which has a long lineage, goes back to early 20th century, really, which for policy is long. And I'm dissatisfied with the inquiry literature on two fronts. One is conceptual, and one is methodological. The conceptualisation issue basically stems down to the fact that where they do bother to talk in terms of concepts, scholars who look at inquiries boil it down to a very simplified two-stage concept. On one hand, you have usually a committee learning lessons over here, and on the other hand, you have a central government department either accepting and implementing or rejecting those. For me, this two-stage conceptualisation really blights the literature and downplays what inquiries are. And this is because that simplified rendition, it downplays the complexity of the policy process, okay, which involves many stages which aren't always sequenced. It downplays the fact that governance is about crowds of actors, lots and lots of different actors. Different actors have different rationalities that are not really always anything to do with lesson learning. And it simplifies policy learning into a very narrow view of implementation, a kind of tick box process whereby we implement and learn in a narrow fashion. And that excludes a whole world of learning. And if we know anything, it's about different dimensions of learning. And that's our business. So I'm not happy with the conceptualisation. I'm not happy with the methodology or lack of it. In inquiry literature, there's a total lack of generalisability. There's a total lack of method. It's predominantly descriptive and rather old constitutional. There's no historical comparison. There's no international comparison. You get a lot of autobiography, but very rarely do you get any interviews, for example, conducted in a systematic manner. So I think the field is stale. I think that's why it's riddled with suppositions. And it's fine to make the case that inquiries may be a 19th century mechanism operating in a 21st century world. And that's fine to make the argument. But I don't think it's acceptable to have a form of 19th century scholarship underneath that. Okay? So that's my response, that's my rationale, and that's my introduction to the book. My response is both conceptual and methodological as a consequence. What I want to do, and what I've done in the early chapters of the book, is say, okay, we need to reconceptualise the inquiry to drag it into the 21st century. I use the phrase reboot, which I know Ryan likes. Reboot. I want to reboot our conceptual understanding of the inquiry and really give it a makeover, 21st century makeover, because it's old and ugly scholarship. The principal way I do that is by acknowledging complexity. Okay, I'll talk about that in a second. So I have a fourfold reconceptualization, which I then use as a framework to interrogate 4 case studies. So it's 4 international case studies driven by interviews, and the idea with using interviews is to provide depth across a range of different actors to again invite in that complexity. Okay, so I want to turn to that process of reconceptualizing inquiries and the 4 elements. The 4 elements are process, agency, types of policy learning, and logics for action. Okay? So, excuse the rather crap PowerPoint, but I do think they add something. Not always to the older generation, but I think they add something. I knew somebody would say that. So in terms of process, what I'm interested in doing is looking at the process through which lesson learning takes place, and I'm interested in widening the lens, and by that I mean adding more stages to that simplified two-stage conceptualization, but also disassembling it, questioning both empirically and normatively whether a linear process is an accurate description, but also something we want to see in a learning process, and questioning the kind of stagist, sequenced rationality of learning within that. Because, if you talk about practice as learning, that's not necessarily conducive to an institutionalized sequence at the centre of the polity. Anyway, by widening, I simply mean adding extra stages in. Okay, and these stages are really important because what I'll talk about, I'll use this as the nomenclature for the findings. Okay, so I want to talk about knowledge acquisition, how an inquiry produces information through format and methodology, legal hearings, for example, versus external research. I want to then talk about knowledge production as a craft exercise and an interpretive process, which is crucial. I want to talk about knowledge transfer. It's a horrible phrase, but in this context I'm talking about a political communicatory process through which the knowledge produced in an inquiry moves around different agencies. I want to talk about knowledge assimilation, not implementation, assimilation. And I want to talk about that in both behavioural and cognitive terms. Okay? And finally, I want to talk about institutionalisation. It's not just about implementing, it's about hardwiring lessons into government across time. Okay? Memory is crucial. Okay? So that's what I'm doing under process. Agents is a little bit simpler, continuing with the ring form here. Basically what I'm saying is governance is a crowded affair. There's a range of groups well recognised in policy learning literature that are never considered in relation to inquiries. Inquiry literature looks at the chairs of inquiries and the officials. And I want to look beyond the usual suspects to see what actors are potentially important. And some of them are put up here. So you can see that this issue of, there's a process, a typical process in inquiry literature, and I want to make it more complex in terms of conceptualisation. So if I tip my cap to the IR people in the room, this is the only IR reference you'll get. Haas's Epistemic Communities. I really like it, and I like the fact that he says epistemic communities and experts can be the baggage handlers of ideas. I think that's a great phrase. It's a great phrase because it sums up knowledge transfer. So how relevant are epistemic communities to inquiries? Sabati's advocacy coalition teaches us to look for pluralistic politics within policy subsystems. Kingdon's policy entrepreneurs market the ideas that emerge from a learning process. But also within an inquiry you have a group of people who are just not considered in research. The seconded official, the researchers and so on. Okay, so this is descriptive to some extent, but I'm also looking to trace the movement, generation, legitimation of ideas through these unusual suspects. Types. So what I want to do here is go beyond what Peter May has defined as instrumental learning. Okay? So instrumental learning is the typical way in which lesson learning is defined in relation to the inquiry. So it's a very simple process. Instrumental learning means new data about the tools of government, policy redesign, and then new instruments. Okay? It's a very narrow definition of a type of policy learning. And what May said in a fairly seminal article was, well, you get at least two different additions to the policy learning process. One of them is political learning, and that's when policy actors learn how to use discursive techniques to get what they want. And the other is social learning, and that's following a big lineage going back to Hecklow and Peter Hall that suggests that the state is puzzling through societal change, and that's how it's learning, through that interaction. And again, what I'm doing here is saying, well, this is the typical way in which inquiry literature addresses the issue, but look at all these different possibilities. And in the book, this forms into a typology, which has, a couple of subdivisions. One is cognitive and behavioural. That's really crucial for learning, because you can change your thinking but not change your behaviour, and vice versa. You can change your behaviour without learning anything. But also individual versus collective learning is a crucial distinction. Okay. Organisational learning in the typology simply means collective institutional coherence, okay, or changes to routines which are institutionalised. Single and double loop learning is a huge area in the learning literature. It comes from Harvard. That's a gyrus to Sean. And double loop learning is a process of reflection that's embedded within the learning process. And the argument around this theory is that when you have double loop learning, you have learning based on the values, assumptions and cultures of a policy process, rather than just the instruments. When you have instrumental learning, that's a single loop process. Okay, I can go back to these if anyone's desperately interested. The final stage of the final elements, logics for action. And I use this phrase specifically because for me, when you think about rationality, I think about an individual or a collective logic for action. So I'm really engaging here with rationalities. At the centre of any lesson learning process in the inquiry literature is a focus on a foundational form of lesson learning. The assumption that lessons can be developed and change implemented through foundational knowledge, apolitical evaluation, and the rational purpose of actors who are incentivised to make changes. No one would be surprised to hear that there are alternative logics at work in any learning episode that run contrary to that logic. So we've spoken a bit about political logics, agenda management, blame avoidance. Those have nothing to do with lesson learning. Legal logics are about often determining liability, culpability, looking back in time with forensic detail and interpretation, with a respect for natural justice. These run contrary to policy lesson learning, which is about looking to the future and policy development. Public managerial logics. It's all right. That's all right. Public managerial logics are about acquiring and producing knowledge that fits with the prevailing norms of the public management system. And then the logic of the bereaved. Nikki spent at least 6 months telling me I should never use the word victim as we wrote a paper together. So I've changed it to the logic of the bereaved. What do the bereaved want? They want catharsis, they want ceremony, they want symbolism, they want simplification in terms of causal stories. None of these things have much to do with lesson learning again. So the argument here is that which logics dominate, how they mix, their compatibility is crucial to understanding all of those stages I mentioned earlier. And in that regard, what I'm really looking at is intersubjective awareness, respect and coherency. So this is a bit of a kind of meta category, I think, that underpins the other three elements. And I'll come back to that when I wrap up. So that's my 4 ways of giving the inquiry a makeover. I then take that conceptualisation or reconceptualisation and apply it to 4 case studies. So at this point I can kind of acknowledge a gap in the research because I've only done 3 and I've yet to choose a 4th. I know what I want, I just haven't picked it yet. So if we're interested in doing some puzzling together, then this might be the point to think about. So I've looked at the 2007 UK floods and the Pitt Review. I've looked at the Victorian Bushfires Royal Commission. I've looked at the Canterbury Earthquakes Royal Commission. So the design's fairly straightforward. I want a design that includes Westminster systems to give me some degree of comparability, but it's a most different design. Different formats are engaged in these inquiries, but also different threats. Earthquakes, 185 dead. Victorian bushfires 173, PIT 13. The threat is important in terms of what you get in terms of format, process, etc., etc. So there's a most different element. So I know for my fourth case study I want to go to Canada. It's a Westminster system I haven't looked at, not because I just want to go to Canada. I know that I want a case study that has a reduced threat, okay, and I know also that I don't want a judicial-led inquiry. I want something that maybe relies more on expertise or policy. So I've got a couple of suggestions, but we can talk about them later. So that leads me to the findings. And all I'm going to do is just talk through, I guess, the 5 most important findings. How long do I have? 15 minutes?
About another 10 to 15. 15 max.
Okay. So I'll go 5 findings. Finding number 1 is the importance of knowledge transfer. Absolutely crucial stage. Absolutely crucial, however, that knowledge transfer is considered during the knowledge acquisition and knowledge production stages. Okay? In other words, you need to know your audience. Okay? It seems self-evident, but you would be amazed. So the assimilating audience must be respected. Those who produce lessons need to understand how the people and the agencies waiting to hear them, what they consider to be valid knowledge, how they frame that knowledge and how they interpret knowledge. Okay? And here, I don't know if you can see these quotes. So this guy's the Chief Secretary of the PIT Review, really dynamic, go-getting civil servant, and this is the chair of the Earthquakes Royal Commission. So on the left, this dynamic public servant, he gets together with the Secretary of State and the chair of that inquiry, and they say, what do we want? We want an inquiry that cannot be shelved. It can't be rejected. So they do everything to ensure that it's not shelved. Instead of having hearings, they have stakeholder consultations where they co-constitute the lessons with the people that have to assimilate them. He works in the Treasury. He knows the first thing Treasury does when they get an inquiry is say we can't afford it. So he came from Treasury, so he writes a cost benefit analysis and a costing for the whole thing in their language. Can't be rejected. They provide a blueprint for implementation. They provide mechanisms of oversight. When they do the thing and they give it over, 95% of this inquiry is implemented. They can't say no. The judge, when you ask him, did you think about this? He's like, I'm a judge. Why are you even asking me that question? Of course I don't think about implementation. Of course I don't think about who's going to read this. My job, and it should speak for itself, is to give a report and people can do what they want with it. It's no accident that 5 years after that inquiry, none of it's been implemented. Okay? 3 or 4 things from 179 recommendations. No respect for knowledge. Transfer as the acquired knowledge. Second finding is memory. In each of these cases, learning's taking place in some form or another. In each case, a degree of amnesia has set in. Okay? Amnesia, to some extent, unlocks the starting puzzle for this book. We learn lessons, we change, and then we forget. So amnesia in this book is broken down into political amnesia, institutional amnesia, Chung effectively in policy agencies, but also social amnesia and complacency out here amongst us. Okay. So long-term memory loss is inevitable. Just ask the PowerPoint dislikers in the room. The older you get, the more you forget. Okay, so the challenge with an inquiry is to sprint towards institutionalisation, to get instruments like legislation locked down as quickly as you can before the forgetting starts. So the Victoria Bushfire Royal Commission was excellent at this. They created an implementation monitor who provided a 5-year period of oversight and made sure lessons were learned and institutionalised in a way which meant they couldn't be forgotten. Okay. In terms of agents, street level bureaucrats are without a doubt the most important but the most ignored in the acquisition and production of knowledge. 50 to 70% of the inquiry recommendations in these cases affected local government, for example. Okay. However, local government and also local emergency services push back. They push back against almost all of those recommendations and were significant influencers in terms of knowledge transfer. And yet they're not considered. Inquiries are central creatures with a central logic, and no one looks at the vertical axis in terms of lesson learning. They continue to look at the horizontal. And assimilation is, to a large extent, determined by these street-level actors. This is a wonderful example. This is a fire chief, one part of England. He says if you're on one side of the A47, you're getting saved by the fire brigade. If you're on the other, you're not. Okay, street-level bureaucracy. So they say 97% of the pit inquiry has been implemented, and here's this guy at the street level saying, well, it depends on what side of the motorway you're on. Okay, so no one's considering street-level bureaucracy in terms of that intersubjective coherency and cognizance of different actors. The fourth and the fifth findings are a means of concluding. In terms of types, what do we see? Predominantly that instrumental learning category. Okay, and that's a good thing. Okay, because instruments work in disaster management. There's been significant floods in the UK since the pit inquiry and the 2007 floods. They were effectively responded to. Okay. They were well forecasted, warnings were sent out in time. The degree of disaster management tools between 2007 and 13-14 grew rapidly, and they worked effectively. If you look at the Wye River recently in Victoria, bushfires down there, evacuation was used for the first time. That's a big instrumental change, actually underpinned with a big cultural change for Victoria. Okay, so you've got significant instrumental change. You've also got good cognitive organisational learning in 2 out of the 3 cases. And by that I mean a sense of joint responsibility, greater levels of coordination, and a cognizance at the implementation stage around the key actors. So that's good. Social learning does not really exist. Okay, people are now already moving back in to high risk bushfire areas. People have already forgotten about the 2007 floods. People have already forgotten about the earthquake in a lot of ways. And this is a social psychological issue. That's where the most gains can take place. So in terms of the big question, do inquiries reduce vulnerability? I think the extent to which we see instrumental learning and cognitive organisational learning in 2 out of the 3 cases says yes, but that still leaves that more important secondary question. And for me, a huge part of the heavy lifting in explanatory terms in this book will rest upon logics for action, and this is where I'll conclude. I know these are big long quotes. For an inquiry to produce usable knowledge, for me it requires an alignment or a synthesis of logics for action across a learning episode. Across a learning episode. Not many logics can do that. A legal logic cannot do that. Okay? Barristers cannot do that because they don't exist at different stages of a learning episode. Technocratic logics cannot do that because they don't exist across all the stages. So you need an alignment or a synthesis of logics which can bring in a public managerial rationality, because that exists across multiple stages. So you have that alignment in the pit review, and Hargreaves is talking about it here. You know, the chair wanted to be pragmatic. I knew how to be pragmatic. Oh, that was a Superman, was it? Oh, just as I come to the crescendo, I get a Superman. The chair wants to be pragmatic, the secretary wants to be pragmatic, and the Secretary of State wants to be pragmatic. And that's what happens. A public managerial logic is intertwined within it. And in his words, they got stuff done. This is not a great quote, but it suggests, or it points to the fact that in the Victorian Bushfires Royal Commission, you still had a judge chairing it, and it was to some extent driven by a legal logic. But you also had two other commissioners who had a public managerial view about the way knowledge had to be crafted, transferred and produced. So as a consequence around that core, you had community consultations, you had public managerial processes of research. The barristers weren't allowed to write the report because they can't write a report for public servants. So there were all these different public managerial changes made within that inquiry that led to it being again a success. And we talked about 97%, almost 100% of that Commission's recommendations have been implemented and institutionalised. If we compare that with the Earthquakes Royal Commission, you have an active senior court judge and two engineers, who never really understood each other. The engineers just shook their head at the lawyers and said, "What are they doing? Why are they talking like that?" And the lawyers said, "We don't really understand these engineers." And they never synthesised. And so they stayed within their logics. They never worked across them. As a consequence, you have an inquiry that's good for victims, nice, lots of ceremony, lots of ritual, lots of representation, and lots of epistemic legitimacy for the conclusions, but you have one that's completely rejected by the people who have to implement it. 8,000 words, 7 volumes. At least 5 different public servants told me they groaned, physically groaned when they saw it, and just said, "We can't do anything with that." And within it, the knowledge that they used was inappropriate. So, that leads me to the conclusion: inquiries can be successful, but only if we understand, respect and integrate the logics for action that exist across a learning episode that is much more complex than extant learning literature credits at the moment. And that's me going out with a whimper.